Good afternoon from Geneva. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the academic track opening plenary of UNCTAD's 7th World Investment Forum. I am Amelia Santos Paulino. I am a member of UNCTAD's Secretariat and I will moderate this session. First, please allow me to introduce the distinguished panelists. We have with us today Anabel Gonzalez, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, she cannot be live with us, but we will be presenting a pre-recorded video. We also have His Excellency Arkebe Okbey Metiku, Senior Minister and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. We also have Beata Jarbosik, Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. With us today also, we have Justin Gifulin, Professor at Peking University and former Chief Economist and Vice President of the World Bank. Also with us today, Mariette Westerman, Vice Chancellor of New York University, Abu Dhabi. Also Professor Raghu Sundaram, Dean of the New York University Lerner Stenoff School of Business. Kunal Sen also with us, who is Director of the United Nations World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki. Professor Laura Alfaro from Harvard University, Farok Contractor, Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University, and President of the Academy for International Business. Jao Nyarko, who is Professor of Economics at New York University and Director of NYU Africa House, the Center of Economic Development and the Development Lab at NYU Abu Dhabi, is also here with us today. Professor Gary Gerefi, Director of the Center on Globalization, Governance and Competitiveness at Duke University. Also Professor Peter Buckley from Leeds University Business School. Emily Blanchard, Professor of Economics at the Tuck School of Business, Dartmouth College. And finally, Professor James Sand, Director of UNCTAD's Division on Investment and Enterprise, who leads the preparation of this forum and also who is the lead author of the World Investment Report of UNCTAD. So this is not your usual academic conference. In this year's forum, we aim to have a closer collaboration and a closer discussion between academics, policymakers, international organizations, and the business sector. We are fortunate to have with us leading scholars and renowned international policymakers who will have an open discussion on the different challenges and changing aspects of the global landscape for international trade and for global foreign direct investment. The session will be organized as follows. After the introductory remarks, the panel members will have the chance to address and debate the issues outlined in our program. We will also have the opportunity to take questions from the audience via the chat function. So we will address the questions to the panelists as they come along and if they are relevant to the discussion. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Mr. James Sands and Professor Farok Contractor, who will provide the opening remarks on behalf of both organizing institution UNCTAD and the Academy for International Business. Welcome, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amelia. Distinguished panelists and academic friends, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening plenary of the academic track of the 7th World Investment Forum. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our long-standing institutional partners and the leading academic institutions and organizations that have contributed to this opening plenary and to an outstanding set of events in the WIF. I'm particularly grateful to our friends at AIB, UNU, Oxford University, and New York University Abu Dhabi, and also to thank the UNCTAD team led by Richard and Amelia in this whole process and in the research area of work of UNCTAD. Now, for more than 3 decades, UNCTAD has contributed to the thinking, research, and policy analysis on foreign direct investment and the activities of multinational enterprises, international production, and their development impact. 2020 marked the 30th year of UNCTAD's World Investment Report. That's our flagship publication in the UN. Every year, the report features the latest trends and issues in cross-border investment globally and analyzes fundamental topics related to FDI and sustainable development. You are all familiar with our World Investment Report series. We included a brief overview of 3 decades of research on international production in our reports as part of our theme chapter last year. I will not elaborate on it in my remarks today, as I wish to focus on the future, key emerging issues for research going forward. I wish to emphasize that our report has always had a symbiotic relationship with our friends in academia. Some of you are here, like Professor Peter Buckley. Some of our long-standing contributors were instrumental for the success of the report, and every year we try to maintain the synergies through inputs from scholars, peer reviews, and feedback sessions. Vice versa, I'm very happy that World Investment Report over the years is also cited extensively in academic research. And not just for the data it provides, but also for the head of curve analysis in our theme chapters. We're constantly looking for improvement on the symbiosis. A key vehicle for that is our academic journal, Transnational Corporations. We have done a lot of work to improve the standing of our journal in the last few years, thanks to the editorial team and advisors, and team led by Richard Baldwin, Amelia, and Hans. The journal's citations are on a solid upward trend. We make every effort to ensure that the research published in it is policy relevant and feeds into our World Investment Report. Most papers published in the TNCJ are cited in our policy reports. Let me turn to the key and emerging issues that I foresee will underpin many of our discussions in the academic track this week, and that I hope will lead to a new research agenda on investment for development. While 2020 World Investment Report coincides with the beginning of a new phase of the global economy, marked by COVID-19, and it describes not how the pandemic accelerated pre-existing trends, putting international production systems under severe pressure. Declining FDI, especially in manufacturing, growing economic nationalism, and the new industrial revolution risk making it more challenging for developing economies to participate in global value chains, and required a paradigm shift in investment for development policy. Subsequently, I published thoughts in 10 directions of international production, GVCs, and FDI to help our thinking on research avenues. And this, I'm very thankful to Professor Peter Buckley and a number of scholars, and also the sponsorship of AIB for publishing that article. Now, the 10 points I mentioned in the article, I just highlight them. First, more regional and less global value chains, less fragmented manufacturing GVCs, and more concentrated value added, more platform-driven and asset-light value chain governance, growing services share in value chains and offshoring, resilience and national security-driven GVC diversification, decline in global efficiency-seeking FDI, and increase in regional market-seeking FDI, downward pressure on trade in intermediate goods, less on trade in final products, a shift from mass production to mass customization, growing FDI in infrastructure and public services, and the last, a boost for investment in green and blue economies. Today, less than a year later, I could point at a few developments that strengthens some of these 10 points, such as the continued decline of greenfield investment in manufacturing even while the rest of the FDI is showing rapid recovery. The shift in cross-border investment from industry to infrastructure pushed by public recovery investment. And the only part of global investment that kept growing in 2020, and that is still among the fastest growing segments, the green economy, the investment in green economy. So my thoughts on research priorities are necessarily informed by these broad directions and their policy implications. And as UNCTAD, I can give you the concerns of policymakers and their policy priorities. Your task in general, and this week in particular, is to translate that into policy relevant research directions. Just to give you some examples of major policy concerns, not exhaustive, that should guide us in our thinking this week. First, the implications of industrial policy and development strategies of the GVC international production evolution that I described. Second, implications for investment policymakers, investment authorities, investment promotion agencies, special economic zones, etc., of the shift from industrial investment to infrastructure investment and the growing importance of project finance, fundamentally different from classical M&E FDI. Third, how to boost investment in SDGs. How are the drivers and determinants of such investment different? Which policy mechanisms work and which don't? Fourth, reflecting on the fact that we are in an interdisciplinary conference, including also fields such as international economic law, tax law, etc., the continued need to reform international governance of investment and how it can learn from and will be affected by parallel efforts in international taxation. Our conference, with more than 90 sessions on the eclectic range of topics, also provides an opportunity to inject new thinking on research themes for our agenda. I hope you will all use the opportunity to follow as many topics as possible, including through our academic track and our final summary outcome into the fresh multidisciplinary research agenda. I'm sure that with such a distinguished set of panelists at this opening session, will make a great start. Thank you very much. Back to you, Amelia.
Many thanks, James. Farokh, over to you.
I hope I'm being heard.
You are.
Okay,
You are
good.
perfect.
So thank you. I'm currently the 34th president of the AIB, and I know that many distinguished colleagues are not members, so I'll say a few words about the AIB. It was founded in 1976. It's the preeminent academic organization with an explicit focus on cross-border business, economics, and policy. The AIB covers 13 country and regional chapters and shared interest groups, including sustainability, research methods, emerging markets, and teaching and education. The Academy of International Business publishes one of the top 10 business journals ranked within the Financial Times 50 list. What is unique about the AIB is that it is a natural interdisciplinary forum, or network hub, we can call it, for research on global topics, bringing together the disciplines of management, finance, marketing, economics, and so on. After all, any policies, whether they are for multinational corporate strategies or government policies, cannot be viewed from siloed or single perspectives. This is the role of the AIB, rigorous multidisciplinary research and education, specifically focusing on cross-border or international issues. While international travel remains depressed and global supply chains are snarled, other indicators of globalization are already on their way to recovery. I believe that the fundamental rationales for globalization, namely mutual net benefits to participating countries, will continue to drive the growth of international business despite the slight rise in nationalism in some nations. When I use the term net benefits, that recognizes the fact that foreign direct investment or trade is not always beneficial intertemporarily, or that it benefits all population segments equally. While international business has helped to lift billions out of poverty, the challenge is to develop more equity, justice, and sustainability planet-wide. The members of the AIB, coming from a variety of management disciplines, represent a pool of talent and research ideas with practical impact and policy relevance. The topics and professors listed on this week's program, not all of whom are AIB members, of course, illustrates this fertile research and policy agenda. Speaking for myself, here are a few scattered examples of relevant investigations. For instance, what country characteristics attract or repel foreign direct investment, FDI? How will the coming new international tax regimes alter the location of value added? What exactly is the nexus between trade and FDI from an investor's perspective? For instance, in a study of FDI I did with co-authors, we examined many variables across 189 nations, but the one that stood out consistently was the efficiency or difficulty of moving goods through a country's ports. The conclusion being that investors view FDI and trade as two sides of the same coin. And we know that as almost like a cliche for many decades, but that needs to be probed more deeply, drilled down from a corporate perspective. In fact, we do not still have a very accurate estimate of intra-firm trade, where the exporter and importer are one and the same company. International supply chains, balancing cost considerations, which is the whole rationale, I guess, of global supply chains, against resiliency. From a corporate strategy perspective, what is the degree of substitutability between automation and offshoring? And this is, of course, part of a larger related question on the role of IT in the retention or migration of jobs across borders. Another neglected research topic is the use of international licensing of intellectual assets and capability as a substitute for FDI and trade in reaching foreign markets. Some estimates put foreign sales resulting from technology transfers as between $5 and $7 trillion. Finally, what is the role of technical standard-setting bodies in spurring international business? These were just a few random suggestions on topics important for the future growth of cross-border commerce. The esteemed colleagues in this forum will have, of course, many more ideas. I'm looking forward to hearing the many fertile ideas that are sure to surface in the coming few days. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Farokh, and thanks, James, for outlining all the issues and topics that we will be discussing during this panel today. But before we go into talking about the challenges for the international production networks and for foreign direct investment, I would like to hear from Vice Chancellor Westerman. I mean, Chile is one of the top academic institutions in the world, and also she brings to the table significant expertise and executive roles. So before we go into topical discussions, and given that Farokh reminds us the importance of solid evidence-based research for policymaking, in your view, what does it take to bridge the gap between academia, policymaking, and industry? Welcome, Mariette.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for inviting me to speak here. And really am inspired to be part of this conference. We haven't been in the past. I'm an art historian, so I don't have very specific answers to the wonderful sweep of questions that James and Farokh have just laid out. But I can say a lot about what it means to be an educator and a leader of a research institution that is fundamentally connected to its society. So I can be a little case study. And since this conference was meant to be in Abu Dhabi and the UAE, I also would like to virtually welcome you and hope that another time all of you from around the world will be able to come here and visit Abu Dhabi and the beautiful campus of NYU Abu Dhabi that you see behind me. Now, I would say, and that for discussion, as we're having here today, of partnerships in research and higher education between the academy and policymakers in international investment, NYU Abu Dhabi is a great place to come. Working across borders to invest for a better future for all is more relevant than ever at a time of pressing global challenges and disruptions. Disruptions of a technological, environmental, commercial, social, and geopolitical kind. We've heard a lot about them already. Now, NYU-AD, as we call ourselves affectionately, NYU-AD is the right place for this conversation because our entire mission is about investing in the future of international connection, collaboration, consilience, solidarity, and engagement in research and education. And in reality, our entire university, as you'll hear, is a public-private partnership between the government of Abu Dhabi and the private, very global research university that is New York University, that is NYU. Now, I said a version of these very same things exactly 2 years ago at a major international investment forum at NYU Abu Dhabi. And at that point, the total and complete virological and economic upending to come just a few months later was not even in anyone's view. I believe that NYU Abu Dhabi and that other resolutely global institutions of higher education like ours are now even more necessary for the discussion at hand in light of the pandemic. So let me say a little bit more about that and about us, if I may. So the greatest single investment anyone can make, personally or institutionally, is in higher education. University education, we know it, has beneficial outcomes for individuals and for societies in every measure that matters, whether financial or related to health, to productivity, to wellness, to sustainability, or to happiness. To affect these and other outcomes, completing a university degree is the best thing you can do for yourself or for your family or for your community, both in the immediate term and over a lifetime. And as the people who teach you in that university, professors, are motivated by research questions that matter, of the kind we've just heard about, universities should and can be the great research engines for their societies and for the world. We've seen it with the COVID-19 vaccine research. None of the vaccines would have happened had universities not for decades invested in basic research, in mRNA research, for example. Now, universities then, from my perspective, are prime investors in human and societal development. We at NYU Abu Dhabi are one example among many, of course, but as we are only a decade young and are fundamentally a public-private partnership, I hope that our example can serve as one of the opening prompts for this conversation and academic track of the World Investment Forum. So NYU-AD is a partnership of NYU and Abu Dhabi that was started about 14 years ago. We've had about 10 years of full education. And our university offers an undergraduate education that is driven by free inquiry, by curiosity, by basic research, but also by relevance. And as a research university in Abu Dhabi, we don't just have ourselves here driving all this, we mobilize the enormous scholarly and scientific capacities of NYU in New York and in its other sites around the world. And at the same time, our mission here in Abu Dhabi is fundamentally linked to the opportunities afforded by this dynamic city, this crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia, and by this forward-looking country that is the UAE. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. So we opened our doors 10 years ago to 135 students And today we have 1,800 undergraduates, and we're still growing. And they study everything from the sciences and engineering to the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. We're also developing graduate programs, and today have some 125 PhD and master's students who animate our labs, our seminar rooms, and our studios with the creativity and the urgency of youth, which seems very important to this conversation. Our students come from 120 different countries, 120. We're a little UN, if you will. 19% of our students are Emirati from the country here, but that is the largest single cohort. And really, there are very few large cohorts from any particular country. And our students also spend time. They spend semesters at NYU's research sites on 6 continents, particularly our other main campuses in New York and Shanghai. So you can imagine the liveliness of it all. Our curriculum here in Abu Dhabi is propelled by about 335 professors. They themselves come from more than 45 countries. And we select them not just for their great teaching, but of course for their ambitious research agendas across all disciplines that they develop in partnership with entities across the UAE, but also with their colleagues in New York, Shanghai, and elsewhere. Our students are full participants in this research. They generate new knowledge, fresh ideas, and new patents. I'm asked to speed this up a little bit, so I will. I just hope you will come and visit. Let me just give you a few examples of the research, since it is relevant to the questions that are being asked about. We, of course, work in genomics, in climate change, robotics, natural language processing, smart cities, sustainable construction, cybersecurity, and much more, and especially in public health. I will end with that particular example of the many more I can give of patents we've developed and close partnerships with policymakers and with our own scientific networks from around the world. I think if we had not had, at the beginning of COVID-19, a very active collaboration that's called the Public Health Research Center that is developing a cohort study of Emirati citizens to contribute their health data for a better, healthier future, dealing with chronic diseases, as well as epidemics, we would not have been as well prepared as we have been to weather the pandemic and help the country evolve significant new technologies and abilities for rapid testing, as well as abilities to understand the sociological and psychological disruptions of the pandemic. We've done all that in a short 2 years, building on the 8 years that had come before of collaboration. And so I think of us as a little model of being able to create really meaningful, policy effective partnerships of the kind that you asked me to speak about. I hope everyone enjoys a great and productive conference.
Many thanks, Vice Chancellor, and I think you ended in the right note, collaboration, partnership, and I hope that we at the international organization can replicate those type of public-private partnership and development labs that you mentioned. So now we will move to the panel discussion. Many thanks again to our 3 initial panelists. Before we open the floor to our panelists here today, let's present the remarks by Deputy Director General Anabel Gonzalez from the World Trade Organization, who will discuss key trends on investment and trade and key issues related to global governance. We will now give the floor to the video of Anabel Gonzalez.
Hello, I'm Anabel Gonzalez, Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today. Global foreign direct investment flows plummeted in 2020. At $846 billion US, FDI flows contracted by some 40% relative to 2019, sinking to their lowest levels since 2005. Other indicators confirm the magnitude of the collapse in the same period. Announced greenfield FDI projects dropped by 33%, capital investment declined 34%, and the number of jobs created plunged 40%. Supply disruptions, demand contractions, policy shocks, and the pessimistic outlook of economic actors resulting from the impacts of the pandemic and its contagion measures accelerated a steady decline in FDI, which had started in 2015, driven by geopolitical competition, trade confrontations, and disruptive technologies. Even as the global economy moved forward towards a multi-speed economic recovery in 2021, the overall outlook for FDI remains weak and subject to uncertainty and downside risks. This includes the evolution of new variants of the virus, the rollout of vaccination and recovery programs, weak macroeconomic conditions in emerging markets, and uncertain trade and investment policy environment. The experience of past crises raises a further concern, as FDI not only lacked GDP or trade in the recovery, but remained feeble for several years. On the positive front, renewed investment in digital technologies may spur productivity gains in some sectors. The policy environment for inward FDI has on average deteriorated since 2009, with a sharp shift towards impeding FDI since the start of the pandemic. Direct and indirect measures adopted by countries across all levels of development, such as localization requirements and policies affecting the entry, screening, and regulation of investment, significantly hamper FDI inflows. As increased FDI is key to reignite growth, particularly for emerging markets and developing countries with limited fiscal space, unless governments take action to reset the FDI policy mix in a way that is conducive to attracting new investments, recovery will remain elusive. Countries will also miss on the positive contributions of FDI to rising productivity, increased global trade integration, innovation spillovers, and creation of jobs, among others. As more FDI is needed to accelerate the path towards sustainable growth, emerging trends are reshaping production, trade, and investment patterns in ways yet to be fully determined. COVID-19 has further accelerated several tendencies, driving FDI inflows before the pandemic, while new trends will also shape the sectoral composition and geography of investment flows, bringing both opportunities and challenges, and putting additional pressure on governments to effectively respond to and adjust to the evolving realities. Salient trends include changes in the structure of demand, digitalization and servicification of the economy, trade, investment, industrial, and tax policy repositioning, and increased attention to the impact of firms' environmental, social, and corporate governance. While emerging FDI trends are playing out, deliberate actions by governments are needed to accelerate the turnaround and attract more FDI. The tendencies driving investment flows will affect countries differently, depending on factors of production, competitive advantages, geographical location, and policy and institutional frameworks, among others. In the post-pandemic context, governments will require the evidence and analysis that academics can provide on topics as important as unlocking, scaling up, and leveraging FDI flows for impact, dedicated policies and measures by governments to enhance the policy and business environment, new competitive advantages focused on improved skills, connectivity, infrastructure, and innovation, creation of markets by promotion of competition and innovation, update and revision of FDI strategies, strengthening of investment promotion, alignment of trade and FDI policies, including through expanded networks of trade and investment agreements, and building a strong sustainability proposition, among others. All of these are topics that would very well benefit from the research and analysis of many of you. I invite you to continue doing a great research work and to inform governments and businesses of the options that they have going forward to attract greater and sustainable investment. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a very productive session.
Well, I'm glad that Ms. Anabel Gonzalez outlined the key issues and the key trends that arrive on top of the challenges that the system of international production was facing before the COVID pandemic arrived. And we are talking about 12 years after the peak of the global financial crisis. We are facing deep vulnerabilities and important challenges that I hope at the end of this session we will come out wiser, or at least with more questions that we will put in motion in our research agenda. But first, let me ask some of our panelists to discuss from their different perspectives, what are the salient aspects, the most important issues in relation to these trends, and in special for foreign investment for the the role of multinational enterprises in this setting, and also for the global governance system. I will start with Beata. I would like to ask Beata Jarbasik her views on the role of foreign direct investment for shaping trade and in stimulating innovation in this global connected trade and investment landscape.
Thank you, Amelia. So let me share with you some observations on FDI, picking up on the issues that have already been signaled by earlier speakers. So first, multinationals have been shaping the geography of innovation. It's a well-known fact that the majority of R&D globally is conducted by multinationals. It is also relatively well known that more and more of that activity takes place in foreign affiliates rather than just at headquarters. And here, World Investment Report and UNCTAD has been very important in collecting a lot of those data points and information. It is less well known that over the last few decades, we have seen a rise in global collaborative patents. And by that, I mean patents which involve inventors located in different countries. For instance, if you look at patents filed by entities based in the United Kingdom, 40% of those patents involve a co-inventor located in a foreign country. The same is true for patents filed by Swiss multinationals. In the US, that figure is lower, but still it tripled over the last few decades. It's actually the Japanese FDI that stands out in terms of being engaged much less in those global collaborative patents. Now, these patents are particularly valuable if you compare them to patents developed in a single country, as reflected, for instance, in forward citations. Now, one immediate implication of this rise in global collaborative patents is that inviting FDI can serve as a way of boosting innovation in a host country. And in my own research, I have looked at patterns of innovation and their relationship to investment promotion activity. And what you can clearly see in the data is that sectors that are targeted, sectors that are chosen as priority sectors by investment promotion agencies, tend to see an increase in patent applications and patents granted. And this is true for high quality patents, for instance, patents filed in the US Patent Office. So we look at USPTO just to keep the quality of patents uniform. And in particular, what's interesting is that this rise in patenting is seen when you consider patents that involve at least one inventor from the host country. So my first message to you is that investment promotion can be used as a tool boosting innovation in the country. Now, we've heard a lot in the last year or so about the need to increase resilience of global value chains. We've heard about the need to diversify sourcing strategies, and yet there is relatively little evidence of this happening. And I think that's due to what we have just heard from Annabelle, this subdued FDI flows globally. Because as we know from academic research, multinationals are responsible for so-called export discoveries, for building comparative advantage in host countries, in particular products. And again, you can see this in research results. Sectors that are targeted by investment promotion agency tend to see an increase in exports, increase in comparative advantage, and increase in quality of exports as captured by unit values. Finally, we talk a lot about green issues, and FDI can be an ally when it comes to fighting climate change. again, academic research shows that foreign acquisitions result not only in productivity boost, but also in increased energy efficiency. And if you look at detailed firm surveys, they indicate that among firms that have so-called green management, that are much more concerned about environmental aspects, multinationals are the leaders. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Beata. And you raise an important issue very close to our work, and it's that of investment promotion. And you broaden it to some aspects that are not researched very much in terms of development economics, and it's the role of innovation and investment promotion to promote innovation. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Now, I mean, there is one issue is before we turn into the configuration and reconfiguration of international production, and it's the recent challenges to the global governance system. And here I'm pointing at Emily, because Emily has done some novel work on issues related to protectionism and other trends, and how they have or can magnify the impact of the pandemic on global value chains. So Emily, we want to hear from you.
Excellent. Well, thank you and good morning, or good afternoon, I should say. I'm calling in from the morning. So my research for many, many years studied a virtuous cycle in which there was greater fragmentation of global production, leading to greater investment, greater returns to investment, and governments progressively lowering barriers. And the lowering of trade barriers both encouraged this investment and production fragmentation, and it also responded to investment and production fragmentation as governments around the world saw the benefits of greater economic integration and therefore dropped tariffs. I think what we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years since 2016, but in many ways since 2010 and the Great Recession, is a reversal of this virtuous trend where globalization has slowly been taking hold and protectionism has been on the rise in some countries more than others, certainly, but it's slowing things down. And there are many questions about what this will mean for the economic decisions of firms. And firms, multinational firms or individual firms, are the drivers of economic activity. So there's a real question in what will happen next. And I think in asking that key question, we have to think about, well, why have things reversed, right? That soul searching is worth having. And so there are a lot of answers here, and a lot of academic research gives us insight into what has changed in the 2010s versus, say, the 2000s. Some of this is just due to technology, certainly. Automation in particular has reduced the drive for many firms to engage in a certain kind of investment, export platform investment, for the purpose of leveraging labor forces overseas. So certainly technology has a piece of this, reducing the profitability of fragmentation. But a lot of it also is about, in fact, most of it is perhaps about politics and policy. And here I'll just identify there's the domestic politics piece, very different in different countries around the world. But we would be naive not to recognize that there have been rising domestic political pressures in many countries, quite conspicuously, including the United States, pushing against those same forces of globalization that have driven investment flows for the better half of 70 years. So that's certainly a piece of it. And we can ask again, political scientists and economists and sociologists will tell us lots of reasons why domestic political winds have shifted, but it has things to do with market fundamentals like rising economic inequality. A lot of this is being driven by servicification and winner-take-all gains. There's increasing concerns about technology and what that means for national security. And increasingly, we have concerns about deeper trade agreements and the provisions in them butting against the interests of national sovereignty, right? So as governments make agreements that go deep behind the borders to cover things like labor protections or regulation or environmental rules, there is a very natural and understandable pushback by many constituencies and voters saying maybe this has gone a little too far. So domestic politics is a piece of it. And of course, there is the elephant in the room of geopolitical shifts on the broader stage. And here I look in particular at the rising tensions between the US and China as a piece of this, but again, not the only piece. So globalization was already happening, production fragmentation was already slowing, and then we add COVID, right? And COVID has exacerbated many of these concerns about the inherent risks to globalization. It has simply changed the game in terms of the policies governments are considering and the politics between governments as they make policies. And of course, that increases policy uncertainty for firms making decisions about how to produce products made in the world through different supplier networks and supply relationships. And it very much changes the landscape for international investors, as they now have to think about what is this new perspective on potential increases in tariffs or other border barriers, but also shifts in industrial policy, right? Simply put, the global economic landscape and the policies that shape those incentives for firms has shifted dramatically because of COVID, and it was shifting before COVID, right? And there are lots of pieces going on here. So I think as we try to make sense of this in the academic world and try to understand what is happening and what trends will be most important, we need to first and foremost recognize that not all investment is equal, right? And so a crucial distinction that we make is the difference, say, between market-seeking investment and export platform investment, right? So for example, if we're going into a world where border barriers may continue to rise or stay high, then countries who are investing to seek foreign markets have even greater incentives to invest because maybe trade is more difficult. Whereas other sectors, export platform sectors, would say, okay, now maybe the risks of investment are too high because I don't know if I'll be able to combine the products that I've produced in the same way in the future. So recognizing the inherent differences across different kinds of investment is absolutely key in understanding the forces that are critical today and shaping global investment flows and understanding, therefore, what may happen next. The other piece I will add, and I'll end here, is as we think about the way that policy choices will respond to the global pandemic, and again, national security and technological changes before that, it's absolutely essential to recognize that trade barriers and tariffs may not be the chief battleground. It's been very conspicuous and easier to measure, but industrial policy is shifting very, very rapidly in countries around the world. And that's going to change the choices and the incentives of firms, where and how they invest. And governments, of course, will have a very important role to play in this. So there are lots of key questions for us as academics and for policymakers and the policy community to be thinking about. I'm always reminded, and I frequently remind my students, we're very fortunate to live in interesting times. And these are incredibly interesting times. I'll end there. Thank you, Amelia, for asking me.
Many thanks, Emily, and many thanks also, Beata, for the brilliant opening to this discussion. I will not even attempt to summarize what you said, but you highlighted several important issues that later on our other panelists will discuss, like industrial policy, issues related to inequality. Not all investment is equal, and the impact is not equal and it's not automatic. So we will come back to that, and also issues of structural transformation and global governance. But before we go into the development questions and aspects, let me ask Professor Peter Buckley. Emily touched on the issue of reconfiguration of global value chains. So if you can tell us from your research and from what we have been doing at UNCTAD in terms of regionalization, reshoring, and diversification in different regions, what in your views are the the key questions and the key challenges that researchers and us in the other side of the table should be taken into consideration.
Thank you. When we look at global value chains and the management of global value chains, I think one of the interesting ways to look at this is to look at the issues facing managers, actual managers and decision makers in multinationals. Now, at the moment, all the publicity is about logistical bottlenecks, frictional issues, and so on. But I think what we have to do is to ask, what are the long-run trends? What are the long-run underlying issues that managers have to think about when they're looking at reconfiguring value chains, regionalization, and so on? And I think there are five. I think there are five key issues. The first is the move away from simple efficiency and from the WTO rules-based system. So all kinds of other issues are coming in. I don't think it's feasible for a manager now in a multinational to just say, what is the most efficient way that I can run my company? Because there are a host of other issues. And I think we have to think about and research the pressures and the issues that managers face. So the first one is the move away from efficiency in general. Secondly, building in resilience. We've heard a lot of this. And here we've got, this is where, again, we start to interact with policy, because the danger is we're going to face subsidy wars. We're going to have countries that seek out investments and seek out opportunities for beggar my neighbor policies by subsidy, by offering resilience and so on. I've recently seen a topic, a phrase, I don't think I invented it, which is called friend shoring. So we don't have home shoring or offshoring, we have so we configure our value chain so that the whole of the value chain is with our friends. It's not so we reduce the risk of political difference. And this plays to the points that have already been made about the fracture in the world economy between China and America. Look at the battle over semiconductors and all the rest of it. The third thing that a manager has to consider is now human rights, is labor standards, is the fact that I could be a perfectly ethical company in my home country, but if I am subcontracting, if I have a contract with a company that's not playing by the rules of labor standards and human rights, consumers and others, civil society will come down on me very heavily. So I have to think as a manager about these kind of issues. The fourth thing, and of course, writ large, is green trade. We have to think about our carbon footprint. We again have civil society clamoring for net, neutral carbon and targets and reducing carbon footprint. And the fifth thing, and this is again a massive issue for policy, is security. So there's issues of food security, there's issues of biosecurity, there's issues of national security. So the point here is that configuring value chains is not just a simple exercise. It's not just about the economics, it's about the politics and the sociology and all the rest of it. And managers have to think much more widely. Now, in terms of regionalization, it may look very simple and straightforward to regionalize value chains. The problem is there's a lot of inertia in the system, and there aren't many countries that offer, for instance, the panoply of offers that you get in China. So reshoring, moving away from China is not an easy thing. So in the short run, there are bottlenecks, there are rigidities, there are issues. In the longer run, these can, and I think will be overcome. I was asked at the depth of the pandemic, do you have any hope? And I said, the only hope that there is two things. The first one is flexibility, the ability of the global system to be flexible. And the second is something that has been talked about a lot already, which is innovation. So if we have innovation and flexibility, we have a chance. And my argument about policy will be to think about policy as enhancing flexibility and innovation, and not putting barriers in the way of those two things, which are probably the way out. So reconfiguring of value chains is now a much more complex thing than it ever was, needs to be thought through very carefully. And please, when we design policy, let's think about the poor old manager who has to reconcile all these different pressures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And let me pick up in your final point, business strategies and M&E's global strategies. I would like to ask, I mean, we are fortunate, we have a very, not only distinguished, but also we have a wide range of expertise around the table today. And I would like to ask Professor Raghu Sundaram, who has not only capital markets and macroeconomic experience, but also he leads one of the top business schools in the world. I mean, what do you think about these new historic movements in terms of taxation, in all that is happening in terms of capital markets, and how do you think that will affect the behavior, the governance strategies of multinational enterprises? Thank you very much, Professor Sundaram, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was unmuting myself. Thank you, Emilia. Good day, everybody. Beata, Emily, Peter, you've raised so many interesting points. I don't know where to begin, but let me address the point that Emilia made, because in the middle of all this nationalism and all the protectionism that is coming in, the recent signing of a taxation of a global tax accord by 136 countries is a rare victory for international cooperation. And it's a significant one. It is been portrayed as being the biggest tax change in over 100 years. So what are its effects going to be? Well, no one really likes to pay taxes. I mean, I don't like to pay taxes. Companies are no different. And on the taxation front, multinational enterprises, global companies have long sought to avoid taxes entirely legally by transferring income from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions. And this has been of enormous benefit to some countries. Ireland, for example, which was a very relative European standards, a very poor country just 2 generations ago, is now amongst the richest countries in the world, as companies relocated there to the low tax jurisdiction. For years, US companies, especially in the technology and pharmaceutical industries, shifted patents and software to subsidiaries in low tax countries and paid the foreign firms licensees to use the assets. Obviously, incentives for such revenue shifting will fall. This is the first effect the tax agreement is going to have. Will it vanish altogether? Will countries continue to game the system to attract companies into their jurisdiction? It's harder to say, but it's hard to see a world in which tax competition will die altogether. And of course, it could lead to substantial new revenue, because the agreed upon rate is 15%, which is higher than the 12.5% rate, for example, that prevails in Ireland. The OECD has estimated that it could lead up to $150 billion extra annually in tax collections. So if you believe tax collection is a good, that's $150 billion more in the in government pockets. So this is one aspect of, I think, of competition, of what is changing the world dramatically right now, that's going to have an impact. And it's had, as I said, it's had a very large impact on some small countries that have used tax systems to grow very rapidly. That strategy will no longer be available. But on a broader topic that I think has been touched upon by every one of the preceding 3 speakers, there are other imperatives that corporations are facing today, perhaps more than ever before, that are more interesting. I think Peter just touched on the green energy movement. This whole sustainability imperative is much more interesting. if we interpret sustainability purely in the sense of environmental sustainability, this is clearly a front and center issues for countries and for companies. Climate change, which Emily also referred to, has clearly played a role in bringing this front and center. And as we've all seen, a number of major companies, most recently Google and Microsoft, have announced very, very aggressive targets to become completely carbon free. Others like Amazon have promised to become carbon neutral. Presumably that means they'll buy carbon offsets. Each of these objectives is laudable, but it's also going to be extremely challenging. Google has admitted that there are no technological ways they can reach their target right now. And as for carbon offsets, we've seen the price of carbon offsets rise quite dramatically. And if that continues, it's unclear whether this will be an economically viable strategy. But I think more interesting for me is multinationals, like all companies, have increasingly started talking in terms of a more inclusive stakeholder strategy. Sometimes we measure this, of course, by ESG metrics, but E, S, and G are very, very different things. And companies that do very well on one of these don't do well on others. So in a recent article on Google, it was pointed out that MSCI gives Google the highest possible marks on environment, but very poor grades on governance. Currently, there's a lot of talk around more stakeholder-focused activities, but we'll really have to wait and see how these get translated into action. How will employees matter? Employees are major stakeholders in a company. How will employees matter? Farooq referred to this at the very beginning when he pointed out that trade has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. And as economists maintain, increased free trade has undoubtedly increased the size of the pie, but there is also little doubt that not only have the benefits been unequally distributed, some have actually lost. When jobs get outsourced, entire communities get devastated. Sorry. And more than anything else, I think this is what has led to the rise of protectionism right now. So how these things are going to play out, I think it's too early to see how much what stakeholder focused management is actually going to mean for this world.
Thank you very much. And as we heard from our panelists, we have interesting discussion happening in the audience, especially on the need to strongly understand not only the economics dimension, but also human rights, law, diplomacy, and all of the other development implications that affect the current geopolitical system. Also, the issue that comparative advantages is not enough, that we also have to address the grand challenges of innovation and of sustainability, and we will come back to some of those issues later. But now let me move on, because the development implications and the policy implications and the menu options for policies have come strongly in this discussion. So let me take the opportunity of that we have here not only distinguished scholars, but also some of you have contributed strongly to the design and implementation of policies at the national and international level. So let me start with His Excellency, Dr. Arkebe Bey, because he led some important processes in Ethiopia, but also with Justin Lin, they published a handbook on innovation and the role of special economic zones with Oxford University Press. So if you can tell us from your view, what is the role of industrial policy on all this discussion, and within this broad policy coherence discourse, what is the role of clusters, special zones, special economic zones, an issue that is also very important for the research agenda of UNCTAD. So I will hear first from Dr. Ogbay, and then I will ask Professor Justin Lee to discuss a little bit the same issue. Thank you very much. You're muted, Dr. Ogbay, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Currently, we are seeing intersecting major trends that shape the direction of global economy as we look at COVID crisis, the issue of sustainability and climate change, and the issue of international governance and the Industrial Revolution 4. These are all impacting on the landscape of policymaking and development. So as starting point, I would like to highlight three important implications for development when we see within the context of COVID-19, as we are in the middle of COVID crisis, which also has brought the economic recession globally. The first one is the vulnerability of the world economy, and major industries and developing economies is one major outcome we have seen. Secondly, we have also seen that government states playing important role, and as earlier Emily mentioned, industrial capacity and industrial policy have already been seen that governments that have focused and had strong industrial capacity were able to cope with the crisis and showing resilience. And third point is that we have seen weak multilateralism, and in the face of major global threats, the pandemic and climate change, as well as international inequalities. So these are key elements we need to consider in the coming decade or the coming phase as well. On the issue of FDI, researchers show, as we all know, the outcome of FDI or international capital or transnational or multinational corporations, it has been uneven. It doesn't bring net benefits or it doesn't bring net losses. The outcome primarily depends that governments who have policies to manage FDI, who are following targeted and very selective approach, has been able to reap, to use it for economic catch-up. And one vivid example is China, Singapore, as we all know, among many countries. So here I would like to highlight three major areas that will help us also to attract productive investment. I prefer to qualify productive investment because from the perspective of developing countries, what we need is jobs, technology and know-how transfer, domestic capability. These are what matter. So this has to start from targeting and selecting sectors that are relevant for the growth of the host country. So the starting point is the productive transformation and the focus on economic diversification and building of productive capacity should be the starting point. And governments have to look whether their policy and strategy started from this point. The second element is how to attract productive investment, not only domestically, but from abroad. We have seen in UNCTAD's report, the latest World Investment Report, that the level of investment has now decreased to 1 trillion FDI inflow. And when in comparison to pre-2008 financial crisis, which was about 2 trillion, this is less than 50% in a month after even 13 or 14 years. And this is, as indicated in the report, the FDI flow to Africa is, for instance, equivalent to what it was in 2005. So here, there is a need for researches and also policy approaches at two levels. First, international level, governments could do, even in advanced economies, how to improve predictability. Predictability is a major issue that has been impacting lower level of investment. And the China-US trade tension can be seen from this perspective. And secondly, also, we have to see how financing for productive sectors could be channeled by blending finance, by de-risking and other innovative financial schemes. Then the other element we need to see is from the national level or host country. And here governments have to improve the institutional capacity that will help them to selectively attract investment. They also need to have policies that help them to develop domestic linkage and capability so that they can benefit from inflow of productive investment. And the third element that would be considered with this is the regional dimension. Like in Africa, African Continental Free Trade Area may have an impact, and we have to see how AfCFTA can be used as a catalyst to attract massive productive investment. The other element I would like to emphasize is the role of special economic zones, or in broader terms, industrial hubs. And I should congratulate UNCTAD for conducting researches on this and covering it on 2019 World Investment Report. And one of the major global research we have been able to manage together with Professor Justin Lin was the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Hubs and Economic Development, which goes in depth on the global experiences in this respect. And here the issue is, what is the relevance of these special economic zones? We know that economic agglomeration and clustering has always been there, but the key focus of this initiative was how can we use special economic zones as a strategy for faster catch up and also develop industrial ecosystem. From the experience in many countries, including Ethiopia, for instance, despite the best effort we put in attracting FDI, the outcome has been less. And the major jump and leap came especially after we introduced new concept of or new generation of industrial parks. In 2007, Ethiopia was attracting below $1 billion, although 2007 was where FDI was amounting to 2 trillion. By 2017, Ethiopia primarily implemented between 2014-15 to after that, and by 2017, FDI attraction quadrupled in about 3 to 4 years because the industrial park concept was able to bring in the required ecosystem and also accelerate learning among foreign companies and local companies, and also develop productive capacity. So the special economic zone has to be seen from this perspective and as part of the broader industrial policy perspective. I should also highlight one final point. A key element here is how do we integrate with the new trends or drivers, especially accelerated technological development, as well as sustainability and climate change is a key issue. And this has to be embedded in the industrial policy approach, in the special economic zones approach. In Ethiopia's experiment, the building eco-industrial park and following carbon neutral industrialization must be the pathway for developing countries, not only for advanced economies. So these are the points I would like to highlight. There are key aspects that should also be considered in implementing and designing productive transformation, such as we cannot isolate it from the macroeconomic constraints. We cannot isolate it from the issue of education, which was highlighted by one of the panelists. And we have also to link it, all this digital transformation require not only skilled personnel, but also infrastructure, which is green. So this needs to be seen, and I think researchers should focus on going deeper on these issues. Thank you, Amelia.
Many thanks, Dr. Ogbay. Professor Lin, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to speak in this forum, and especially to speak after my brother, Dr. Akabe, and on the same issue. I'd like to make 3 points. about industrialization. The first point is that industrialization is the foundation to achieve many goals in the SDG. You understand, goal 1 is no poverty. Goal 2 is zero hunger. Goal 3 is good health. All those are desirable, but they need to have the jobs for the people. If they have the job for the people, they have income, they will not be poor, they can buy food for themselves, there will be no hunger. And then certainly they can take care of their own health. But if you look into the world, even you go to a low-income country, poor country, people, they all have jobs, but their jobs are not decent. And how to give decent jobs? I think goal 9, industrialization, technology, and infrastructure are the way to provide decent job for the people to have decent income. And certainly, most people, they work in agriculture. And if you want to raise their productivity and income, we should bring infrastructure and also technology to improve agricultural productivities. But agriculture alone will not be able to generate sufficient decent jobs, because if you look in the world, for those countries can move from low income status to middle income status and on the way to high income status. There are always transformation from an agrarian economy to industrialized economy. So from what I see, if we want to bring the decent jobs to the low-income country to help them achieve the SDGs, we need to have industrialization. That's the first point. And then my second point, that industrialization is possible in every country. Certainly, they need to follow the competitive advantages. If in a low-income country, certainly they will have comparative advantages in the labor-intensive industry, because labor-intensive industry, the most important input is the labor force. And in a low-income countries, that the wage rate must be low. And if you have industrialization, that along their competitive advantages of labor-intensive industries, they can have low factor cost of productions. And those kind of labor-intensive industrialization can provide the most job to accommodate the out-migration of labor force from the agriculture to manufacturing sectors. That's the first thing. But certainly, that if we go to the low-income country, not only they do not have industrialization, they are facing the issue of deindustrialization. And for that, I think the main reason is that the competitive advantages only determine the factor cost of productions. But if we want to compete in domestic market and international markets, it's a competition of total cost. And total cost includes not only the factor cost of production, but also the transaction cost. And transaction cost is determined by whether you have adequate infrastructure, and also whether you have attractive business environment. But if we go to a low-income country, in general, their infrastructure is poor. Their business environment is very bad. And because of that, the transaction costs in many developing countries are too high, and even they have competitive advantages in the labor-intensive industry and so on, they cannot develop those kind of industry. And so by that, if we want to make industrialization in a developing country to be realized, we need to reduce the transaction cost for the in those kind of country. But because of the infrastructure in a developing country is poor for the whole nation, and the business environment is also poor in many dimensions. But if you rely on market spontaneous forces, they are not going to improve, and you are not going to see industrialization. So we need to have the government to play the facilitation role. But the government resources and implementation capacity are limited. So under this kind of situation, we need to have the industrial policy, as you just mentioned, to target the industry which you have latent comparative advantages. And also to use spatial economic zone as a jumping pad. You identify some enclave in right location, and in this spatial economic zone, make infrastructure adequate. And also you can apply the one-stop services and to make the business environment simple. And with this, I think every country can use spatial economic zone targeting the industry that they have latent comparative advantages, and with the government facilitation, you can have quick wins. And in those kind of spatial economic zone, it can create job, export general revenues to the government, and then you can further scale up your spatial economic zone to the other areas. And for this, I think that Dr. Akabe have a lot of experience of that. And I wish that Dr. Akabe, you can say more about how you make those kind of things happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Certainly on the last round, you will have the time to come back and reflect on some of those issues. Before I go back to the importance of the investment environment and technology for industrial policy and for development, let me zoom in, because you mentioned the issue of infrastructure and the issue of transaction costs. But before I go into to ask Zhao and Beata some specific questions on technology, including digital technology, please let me bring Laura to the discussion, because she has done a lot of work on the role of foreign direct investment and development, and what are the policy options to maximize, to foster the positive role of foreign direct investment, or the policy options to address the challenges such as inequality that we all have raised here today. I will come back to you, Zhao and Beata, but please let me welcome Professor Laura Alfaro from Harvard first. Laura, welcome.
Hi. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me take 30 seconds just to congratulate you people at UNCTAD and the United Nations family, because you just had appointed someone as the chief, the head, that I think is a fantastic human being, and I think it was an inspired choice. Rebecca Greenspan, she was my micro and trade professor back at the university. And again, I just wanted to take 30 seconds to congratulate you on that amazing choice. And thanks also for inviting me. This has been great. I'm afraid I may start to sound a little bit redundant in some of the topics. So perhaps I will take the opportunity to be a little bit more provocative. So I think in general, for many developing countries, and when I think developing countries, I tend to think countries like Costa Rica that are perhaps a little bit smaller. I do think that the policies that help firms and workers gain from potential spillovers from FDI are also policies that help attract foreign firms. So if we think of FDI as a bundle that includes technology, know-how, and capital, if a country invests in infrastructure, education, free capital markets, rule of law, good, stable macro policies, flexibility, I think these are policies that allow the firms to benefit, but also, as I said, to attract foreign firms. I think I call them win-win. And it also allows domestic firms also to foster and grow. We also want domestic firms to become national champions, if you want. And I would say that it's a little bit simplistic to argue that Ireland developed out of low taxes. I think when you talk to the folks at Invest in Ireland and all their agencies, they had a very cohesive and well-formed strategy that did include this infrastructure, education, capital, and they were also a very good, flexible country. It was a country that could bring managers and workers together and government to change policy and react. And again, they had other sources of funding. They had income tax, VAE tax. So again, I think we can think broadly of different sources of income. So in this perspective, I worry about the lacks of infrastructure. Again, I come from Latin America. The low interest rate decade went by and we didn't invest in traditional infrastructure, ports, airports, so on and so forth, roads, but also we didn't invest properly in digital. And we have found out this, connection, hardware, software. The pandemic has been devastating in many ways. Teleworking has opened opportunities. And I think, again, these investments in digital, and I think it will be discussed more broadly, allows opportunities. I actually do believe we can develop out of services. I do worry sometimes this excessive view of industrialization. Teleworking has open opportunities, tutoring, therapy, health, consulting. These all can be done from anywhere, and this opens the opportunity for services. And in this, I worry about education. We need to invest in education, but we need to invest in math and science. And we need to invest in math and science and girls. I want more girls doing math. I worry even in Massachusetts, that is one of the best, if not the best states in the US, that I don't see enough girls doing math and science. The test in Massachusetts showed huge lag in math. And again, this is one of the best states, if not the best states in education in the US. Go to Latin America, go to my country, Costa Rica. We were lagging in PISA exams in math before the pandemic. The government had the not so inspired policy of sending kids 2 years home. We're the OECD country with the least number of school days, and there's still not the urgency to teach those kids. And again, math seems to be the topic where we would see the most lags. So I think we need to invest in math. I also worry about the lack of stable macro environment. Macro policy needs to smooth shocks. There was a role for fiscal, there was a role for macro, but it needs to smooth shocks. It does not need to send the world in warp speed. And this is what we're seeing. If you see some trends in the US, non-durable consumption is 30% above the pre-pandemic level. It is very hard for firms to plan and invest in this environment. The auto industry had this problem. In the pandemic, they thought no one would buy cars. Then everyone bought cars. They had not ordered enough chips. When they started to order chips, they were competing with absolutely the whole world that was buying washing machines and computers. Now everything has a chip. We had bad luck, company burned. There was something climate in Texas. The world has no capacity and is part of this excess monetary policy. Every developing country has increased interest rates because of the fear of inflation. Inflation affects the poorest the most. Income inequality in Latin America goes hand in hand with a history of inflation. This is why Latin America was the first to increase interest rate. The poor have the least capacity to deal with inflation. Only the Bank of England has announced an increase in interest rate. What happens with the rest of the developed world? And I finish here with the role of multilateralism. I come from a small country. I am a child of globalization. I benefit from globalization. If we close, probably Costa Rica can survive. God knows I can live from bananas and coffee, but we won't develop. And so we need big countries to honestly come and open themselves to multilateralism. If we're not going to talk about inclusive diversity and ending world poverty, let's be honest, and let's all come together and have policies that don't have negative spillovers to the poorer countries that have the least capacity to deal with this. And as a small country, the only thing I can do is continue to preach that multilateralism does benefit all of us. And so let's go back to the table and honestly work for it.
Many thanks, Laura, and you definitely challenge us. I think she put many things out there that we can come back in the closing session, especially the issue of policies and the induced inequalities due to policies not only of countries and trade partners, but also policies of multinational corporations. And now let me steal 30 seconds because you're from Costa Rica. In March, we published a report on how multinationals can transmit policies, gender policies and practices to the host country. And this is an issue that usually when we work on trade, we tend to look at the transmission mechanism of trade via employment, technology, and so on. But the aspect of how multinational enterprises, when they come to the host country, affect the local gender policies and practices and other aspects of development is very important. And in the case of Costa Rica, we saw that there was a positive transmission from the MNEs, the IT sector, to the local market in terms of replication, in terms of coping standards, and in terms of education of the female labor force. So I think there are many broad issues that we can open here and put on the agenda that we haven't discussed, but I'm glad that you mentioned the issue of policy spillovers, but I would like to emphasize not only of countries, but also of multinationals and firms. With this, please, before I go, we have Kunal Sen here, and I am anxious to ask him about the development challenges and the SDG agenda. But Laura mentioned two issues concerning technology and also the issue of digital technology. Before I go to Kunal, please let me ask Yao Niarco and Beata. Yao, because he works on technology and transformation from the development angle, and Beata, because the bank published recently an important report on digital technology and international production system and global trade and investment environment. So how do you think, I mean, can you tell us from your view how the importance of this technology and digital advancement, as Laura outlined, affect the global trade and investment environment, and whether this could help to close the gap between developed and developing countries, or it will rather hinder the possibilities of having more equal global and investment trading system. So Professor Niarco, over to you.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me here. And first of all, a big shout out to UNCTAD. I've been using your work, your data from maybe more than a decade ago, the ComTrade, and your work with the export statistics. So it's just thank you, and you guys are great, doing a great job. Just wanted to shout out to you. So I do work in Africa, and Dr. Okube, I've been working in your country as well, Ethiopia, a wonderful country with the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange. In Ghana, I'm working with smallholder farmers, helping them rise through the value chain, if you will. And I mention this work because I want to get back to something Professor Sundaram mentioned, which is about the fact that sometimes as we are thinking about all of these theories, there are people who lose jobs, people who could be lost out on all of our, all of our theories, all of our policies, and we need to take that into account. The United States has taught us that trade, foreign investment, we should not take that as a given. It's something which we need to tell the people why it's important and to get buy-in. Otherwise, there are going to be some sectors of the society that are just going to rebel. So I would like to give the viewpoint of the smallholder farmers, the man on the street in Africa, if you will, and all these things that we are saying. What happens? What is the impact? Okay. So, and I'm going to tie all of that into technology. All right. So first, a very quick story, and then I'll go to the technology piece. Earlier on, I was asked about COVID. How does COVID affect everything? So here's the story. We were doing some research in the field. This was early 2020. Our smallholder farmers, they continued producing. Everything was okay on their end. They were withstanding all of the threats of COVID-19. In the rural areas, there was very little COVID incidences there. Everything was in the capital, Accra, and the second biggest city, Kumasi. So farmers were great. Where were the problems? In two areas. One was the agro-processing companies, the people who took the produce of the farmers, processed it. They had intermediary inputs that they had to import. Imports were locked. All of those people couldn't produce. There was a lockdown there, which then affected the farmers, okay? So that was number one. Number two, exports went down, okay? So those companies that used to take from Ghana soya, sorghum, maize, etc., they all stopped. And so all of that went down as well. So exports were affected, agro-processing were affected. Farmers, they did what they were supposed to do. They were great, okay? They managed, they found alternate means of producing. It's the other side which depressed things. And so productivity, sales all went down, farmers suffered. Let's now loop in technology. So about 4 years ago, as part of our research, we went to the Ghana government and told them that, why don't you have a national commodity exchange? Chicago had their commodity exchange in the 1850s. Many European countries have had their commodity exchanges more than 100 years ago. African nations, in part because of colonialism, we never had these big national markets. Let me loop back into technology, okay? The commodity exchange is nothing other than a set of rules and technology. In 2017, we were able to do this commodity exchange because technology was there. It was easier to program things. And so once we got the government to institute these laws, boom, we're there, okay? So with a very small group of people, we were able to create a national institution, all right? So that's the key point there. Dr. Okube, you mentioned the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. There too, we believe that we'll be able to have progress because of technology. We all know Zoom now, so you can get people in Ghana's case, Burkina Faso, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, starting to talk to each other, starting to create markets with each other, okay? All of this is technology driven. In our own center, we now do all of our field research using the mobile phone. And what we like to do as well is not only do the research, but actually implement things on the ground. So we're actually creating markets. We're calling them nano commodity exchanges. And through the nano commodity exchanges, we actually want to start creating things which look like a virtual special economic zone. And so I know, Justin Lin, you had this wonderful volume on special economic zones. As we're thinking about technology, the zones don't need to be only spatial in one particular area, okay? You can make it virtual where you get, for example, the maize ecosystem becomes a special economic zone. You use technology to link people in the country and outside of the country. So that's one of the other projects that we are engaged in right now. And let me just close, if you will, to tell you another area where I think technology has been very important, and that's the wonderful country, the United Arab Emirates, where Dr. Westerman, our Vice Chancellor, told you a lot about what the university is doing, and just loop it back there. So one of the things the country has done is to emphasize technology and use technology for foreign direct investment, for trade, for multinational enterprises. And the anecdote I'll give you is, I was talking to a business person, and Dr. Buckley, you were mentioning about friendshoring. So here is your friendshoring example, okay? So there's somebody in London who is running a fairly large business throughout Africa. That person has warehouses in Dubai, and that person has never been to Dubai, has never been to the UAE, okay? And yet is running a multinational operation all across Africa. And this person is based in the UK, all right? And all of that is possible. Why? Because of technology, the logistics, the discussions back and forth. So again, I'm giving all of you a few examples of things we know, things we're doing in the field all around the area of FDIs, MNEs, and in particular, technology is huge. I think that that's the future. If we're going to do industrialization, if we're going to do cross-border trade, it's all going to be relative to the technologies that we have here. And in the field, we're seeing it happening. We're actually doing quite a bit of that ourselves as researchers. So I think I'll land there, and thank you again. And Amelia, great work you folks are doing, okay? Really impressed with everything. Over to you.
Many thanks, Joe, and many thanks for almost 2 years of conversation. We were planning this, as I said, to have it in your beautiful campus, but we will get there. We will get there. Before I go to Kunal, let me go back to Beata, because you are doing, Beata, very important work on the role of digitalization. So if you can please come back to this particular focus of technology, particularly in the post-COVID context.
Thank you, Amelia. So let me mention to you a few findings from research we've done for our transition report, which we are launching in a couple of weeks. So we looked at the role of digitalization in cutting information costs, right? So access to fast internet, to 4G data, mobile data, means that firms can obtain information about new markets more easily. And this is particularly important for small firms for whom investment in getting information is much less accessible or much less affordable than for large firms. And what we see is what you would expect. In Turkey, rollout of fiber optics cable, which meant access to fast internet, allowed SMEs to increase the number of export varieties. So that is product country combination. So they boosted the volume of exports. We also see that SMEs in services sectors were able to reach new markets within Turkey, so other provinces in which they were not selling before. In Russia, we looked at the rollout of 4G mobile technology, and we looked at firms that were located at the border of the signal, meaning some firms were covered by 4G mobile networks while others were not, and they were actually literally in the same neighborhood. And what we see is that services firms, small firms that benefited from 4G access saw an increase in employment. So all this suggests that digitalization may help emerging markets catch up. But of course, digitalization is not only about infrastructure, it's also about skills. And here there is a danger that progress in digitalization will increase inequalities within countries. Let me give you just one striking statistic. If you ask people who are over 55 years of age, have you purchased something online last year? 2/3 of people in Western Europe will give you an affirmative action. 1/3 in new EU member states, but only less than 1/5 in Western Balkan countries. And when you try to dig deeper and ask people, why it is that they choose not to shop online, many of them will list, actually all of them, most of them will list lack of skills ahead of concerns about payment security. So, what we observe in the regions where we operate is poor ICT skills among older workers, among people in lower income deciles, among people with less education. But I am in particular concerned about older workers because the speeding up of digitalization, which we have seen during the pandemic, means that there is a risk that these older workers will be pushed out of the labor market because they will not be able to cope with the technological progress. Thank you. Over to you, Amelia.
Many thanks, Beata. Before we close to the final part of the panel, I would like to welcome Professor Kunal Sen. Kunal Sen leads the World Institute for Development Economics Research, and WIDER has, for its size, and I was at WIDER for 6 years, one of the broader and research, and I would say the outstanding research agenda on development issues. All this that we have discussed today has a long-term perspective, and also we are closer to the deadline of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 Development Agenda. So in your views, all these issues, multilateral, regional, international production, what are the key challenges that they pose for reaching the SDGs from a development perspective?
Thank you, Amelia. We have 17 SDGs, and I don't think I can speak for all of them. Let me focus on two. I'll talk about SDG 8, which is the good jobs, the challenge of getting good jobs to young workers, mostly in the developing world. And also I want to speak a little bit about SDG 3 on health, because I think it's a very important debate we need to have about vaccines and foreign investment concerning that too. So on SDG 8, on jobs. So if you think of a foreign investment in the past, and we have work that's been done by many of the panelists here on this, foreign investment in the past has created jobs, especially in East Asia, but also in South Asia and Latin America, Central America, and certain countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is essentially where investment went into labor-intensive sectors, wearing apparel, footwear, and so on, brought in technology, brought in skills, brought in capital, and that led to the success of the export-oriented destination model that we saw so well, and Professor Lin talked about that, in many of the developing countries which have increasingly seen convergence living standards to the West. But what we now see is something very different. And that's also to do with the rise of automation. So what we now see, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, is a situation where global value chains are transmitting mostly capital-intensive technologies, mostly to modern firms, large manufacturing firms who are extremely capital-intensive, but do not create jobs. On the other hand, what we see is a large, very extremely unproductive informal sector where the jobs are. And that's true in Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's true in South Asia, which has, of course, the two regions that have the world's poor. So we have this situation now, the foreign investment is no longer the job creating potential we saw in East Asia. And I think this research really poses some important questions, especially with automation being the big threat to creating jobs, even in labor-intensive sectors. And I think we need to think a bit more carefully about how do we bring the small informal sector, this mass of informal firms that are there in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, into the productive economy. And I don't think that's obvious, and I don't think foreign investment per se can be the route that they played in the earlier periods. And I think we need to think about the discussions around skilling, around human capital, around integrating smaller informal firms in supply chains with the larger manufacturing firms which are more capital intensive. And I think we need to think also more in a much better way about what is industrial policy in this context. The industrial policy often was essentially selecting the winners, often the big firms in manufacturing or even services, but that's not going to be the case any longer. So I think that's a really big challenge now for those of us who are really concerned about where the good jobs could come from, especially in Africa and in South Asia. And that's not so obvious where exactly that will happen, and how we can think of policies that can try to target particularly this sector that seems to have most workers, the large informal sector. I just want to speak a little bit about vaccines, because I think that's important too, because what's really now quite apparent is that we're seeing very uneven rates of recovery in the world. The richer countries are recovering very fast. And the reason for that is that they're avoiding lockdowns, they're able to vaccinate their populations. But the low-income countries are seeing this periodic cycle of lockdown, lifting lockdowns, and so on. And as of now, only 3% of low-income country population citizens have just received the first dose vaccination. While in many rich countries, now we're looking at full vaccination rates around 70, 80%. Now, what's the solution? Well, people thought it was COVAX. I'm sorry, that's not working. This year, COVAX only distributed 1.4 billion doses compared to the target of 2.1 billion doses. And what's really happening is richer countries buying up supplies of vaccines to provide vaccines, booster shots, providing it to teenage children, and so on. So COVAX is not the solution. And I think we need to think about boosting. So one argument has been to lift the patent, to have a waiver of patents for vaccines. But patent waiver is not a sufficient condition. It's a necessary condition. Yes, we do need it. Sufficient condition, if we really want to boost production capacity of vaccines in the global south, we do need foreign investment, but maybe the kind of foreign investment which is more south-south. Because we know the Chinese and Indian pharmaceutical companies are the ones who have the technology and actually provide joint ventures can provide necessary expertise for producing vaccines in Africa and other parts of the world, developing world. So I think we have to start thinking more intelligently about the problem of vaccine supply in the low-income countries and simply understand that COVAX cannot be the solution, as it often was thought in the earlier period. And thinking through how can we boost more foreign investment in vaccine production, especially using Chinese and Indian pharmaceutical companies, but not only those two sets of countries. So I think that's really important to think about. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you very much, Kunal. I think we are running out of time, but I really want to have a last round asking you, I mean, what do you think is the key question that we should focus on? Because either one is a priority, or second, because it's under research. I will go back to our panelists, and hopefully you can give us a 1 minute thought, and hopefully we can stay until 2 o'clock and hear from you. So I will start with Dr. Arqueve. 1 minute, what do you think it should be a priority for us and for all of us, all the researchers around the table today?
A key priority, I think, should be how to speed up recovery of developing countries in a way that can build resilience in the long term. Because the critical issue, what we have learned in the current crisis, which is not strictly a public health crisis, it's beyond that, social, economic, and political. What we have learned is that the environment is increasingly becoming turbulent, and we are increasingly living in interconnected world. So here, as Kunal was mentioning, we have seen the digital divide, we have seen the vaccine divide, or let's call it vaccine racism, because developing countries are not getting any vaccines. And developing countries are also not benefiting from, let's say, like SDR, which should have given financial space, fiscal space, I mean. So here, a critical element is there has been many studies on digital transformation, I believe, increasingly the last 15, 20 years. There has been also a lot of studies on globalization, global value chain. But from a developing countries perspective, a key element would be how to build recovery in the short term and in a way that builds sustained productivity transformation. And also to bring in critical issues that will help us to build sustained economic growth. For instance, education, which I think Laura mentioned. How do we transform the education system, especially in developing countries? And here I'm referring both middle and low income developing countries, emerging economies. And this will help us to make the research topic much more relevant. I should also highlight here.
I'm sorry, Dr. Arqueve, we are really short of time, so I really want to hear from the other panelists. Thank you so much, but if you can wrap up.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you so much, and we will have Dr. Arqueve on another panel on Africa, and as I said. Raghu, I had a question that I wanted to ask you, and it's the scaling up financing and investment for SDGs.
Oddly enough, that was going to be my answer to your question. I think if there is anything we've learned from the pandemic, I think all of us have to put our minds back 18 months and remember how much skepticism there was from even the medical community that a vaccine would be possible in a few months. People kept saying it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine, it'll fail. What we learned was how sustained focus on a topic and the role played by small firms here, BioNTech, Moderna, these should not be forgotten. When you look at the the SDGs, they are largely related to problems that technology can solve. Yao highlighted this beautifully in the examples that he gave. In solving the pandemic, the US government, like many others, put its tremendous amount of money behind the enterprise. Now we have to come up with different financing approaches to solve the sustainable development goals. But I think that all of them are within reach because of the extent to which technology now permits innovation. What we need is, people refer to the UAE's approach on this thing. I think Marriott talked about it, Yao talked about it. Their Start AD goals, for example, every country should have a process like this to encourage innovation, to encourage small enterprises. Big enterprises, yes, they invest tons in research, but much of the innovation is actually coming from small groups. And if there's anything we've learned from the last 12 months, it is really that pace of innovation and technology needs to be harnessed properly by every country. Every country is capable of doing this.
Thank you so much. Laura, over to you.
In research question is development, but that's a very broad-based question. And I have to say that my research has not really been about the broad development, but sustained productivity, growth, inclusion. So I'm going to say that because we don't know what we're going to need. I mean, it was mentioned the case of Moderna, that they were there, but they didn't think it was going to work. Like, this is the first time they work. And if you hear the story, it's a fascinating story of rejection. I would actually say, whatever we do, we need to be true to the scientific method. As academics, we need to be true to research, and we need to be careful of interest groups getting in the way of research. So that's what I'm going to say.
Thank you so much, and point well taken. Professor Lee?
Okay, very good. I think as academic, if we want to make our research to be policy relevant, and not only relevant, to make real changes in the developing world, we need to look at the further developing country have, instead of further developing country do not have. We need to look at the further developing country can do well based on what they have, instead of looking at the further developing country could not do well. And we need to advise the government to scale up what they can do well based on what they have. And if we do research along this line, this kind of research will be extremely policy relevant, and it can bring quick changes to the developing world. And those kind of quick changes will pave the foundation for further changes in the developing country.
Thank you so much. Beata?
Thank you. I think we need to pay more attention to trade financing. Pandemic caused increased uncertainty. That meant that exporters were worried whether they would be paid for their shipments. Importers were unwilling to prepay because they were worried they would never see the goods delivered. So what you clearly see in the data is that products which were insured by letters of credit did better, were more resilient. Insurance created resilience. If you backtrack to the global financial crisis, this was the time when trade financing dried out. This hit trade flows as well, quite significantly. And this is an understudied topic that I think deserves more attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's an important topic. Resilience for whom? For countries, firms, people, and something that we are taking on board. Peter?
I think the most important topic in international business is the social purpose of the corporation, because I think the social purpose of the corporation is much more open to wider interpretation I think we have to bring in the role of civil society. And I think that has important implications internationally because it's differently interpreted in different countries. What is ethical, what is employment rights, what is human rights are interpreted, and the multinational enterprise has to work across that. So that is my long run topic, the social purpose of the corporation, its changing role in society.
Okay, Emily?
I think that academics have a lot to add in addressing what I see as one of the chief risks coming out of this COVID pandemic. So the chief risk I see is that governments, particularly governments of large industrialized countries, will turn inward towards reshoring and economic nationalization out of an overabundance or an abundance of caution, but they'll overdo it using blunt instruments. Academics can add a great deal by helping to very clearly identify and articulate what are the material concerns, what are the real risks, measure those, and then help governments target policies so that we don't go too far.
Thank you so much. Kunal?
As an economist, I feel that it's time there was a move away from the big macro question, the broader question that Justin and others have been working on, which is to move towards more the micro question. And I think those are important. But we also seen the pandemic was a global shock. Almost every country was affected. And it shows why it's really important to go back to some of the bigger questions in development. What exactly is it that explains the success of some countries in the developing world and where we have not seen success in many other parts of the world? Those are the big questions we need to go back to. And I think it's really important to use the pandemic as an opportunity to think about the bigger questions in economics. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask both our Yao, and then I would like to ask very briefly, we were giving 5 minutes extra to both our institutional partners, Mariette Westerman, Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi, and Farouk Contractor, to give us a very short closing remark, but let's hear from Yao first.
Okay, so I'll just give three quick one-liners. Number one is let's focus on the man and woman on the street. Let's focus on getting buy-in. I think Emily mentioned that as well. We have to think, we need to leave the top sort of big picture thing and put ourselves in the shoes of the poor person on the streets. That's number one. Number two, Raghu mentioned this very, very eloquently, technology of all kinds, the digital technologies. He mentioned biotech. That's where a lot of things are going to happen. We have to stress technology, development of technology, and actually, as in our case, implement it, try it, even though we are academics, go on the ground and try these things. And number three, the third thing is, and again, Amelia, thank you and your team for getting this academic group together. It's not always that academics are brought to the table. And so let's continue bringing academics here. So I'd like to thank, my sponsors for the research, International Growth Center, anonymous donors. They help keep the academic, sort of work going. And of course, we have here my boss, the Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi. Thank you for supporting our research. And so I just want to put in a plug there that the research we do helps the world. And we, of course, have the Dean of our business school here. So dear Dean Sundaram, keep the funding flowing. All of us here who are faculty and professors, we live on these research grants. So I'd be amiss, it would be bad if I didn't say thank you to you. And please keep doing it. So that's it.
Partnerships. Vice Chancellor.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I want to thank all of you for letting me sit in on your fabulous seminar. I have learned so much and I've taken it all on board, I hope, and will do something with it. I will end with this. There's a wonderful note in the chat here from Ari, van Asja Amelia, who says this has been a wonderful panel. It shows how academia has not stood still in this turbulent global landscape. I want to say something about that particular dynamism of universities. unless universities move forward and move with their societies and help them move along, they die, they shrink. And on this, I want to make an important point, I think. For any of the problems that have been raised here, and we know there are others, it is essential that universities work together with governments and with industry sectors to mobilize the creativity of their researchers in their labs and their studios to tackle these important problems. And I think to do that well, we do need some attitudinal adjustments, both within the academy and in government and industry. And I would summarize it very briefly as follows. From the academy side, the university side, we need to be extremely open to being around these tables and bringing unlike players together onto our own campuses or go to where these actions and conversations happen. And this means for academics moving out of our academic shell a little bit, but at the same time make clear that the world sees, industries and governments see, that academics are not just academic, that they really can contribute. From the industry and government perspective, I would say, as someone who really promotes these kinds of collaborations, I've told you too much about NYU Abu Dhabi, but I have long believed in that intersection. There is no university without society and vice versa. So from the industry or government perspective, I would say, we would really like to see that research grant arrangements, research support arrangements, which so many of us have with industries and governments, are made just a little bit less transactional. We don't mind ROI. We don't even mind KPIs. We are used to that language. We can deal with it. You need returns on your investments and your trust in us, particularly. But we are also educational and learning institutions. And not every problem can be known in advance. I think it was Laura who said, we don't know precisely what we're going to need. So detransactionalizing these arrangements at least a little bit to allow for that open, free flow of ideas that propel innovation with the young people we are training. I think that that's the adjustment that will need to happen in the other direction.
Thank you so much. And finally, I would like to ask our partner, organizational partner, and also long-term research and contributor, the Academy of International Business, on behalf of all the scholars that will be working with us this week. I will ask Professor Farooq Contractor to take his last minute to close this panel. Before that, please let me thank you all for joining. It was a big panel, but our goal was to have, as Marit said, we don't have this type of discussion very often between academics. Us that want to think ourselves as policymakers, because we are between you and the member states, and you keep the ideas flowing. We have some collaborators around the table, Peter, Farooq, Emily, but we hope to broaden our research collaborations, and these questions, we will bring them back to you and to see how we can work together. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and I do hope to keep in touch and to keep working with you. And now I will give, we are on 10 minutes borrowed time. I will give the last minute to Farooq to close this fantastic panel. And thank you to all of you again. Farooq, over to you. You're muted. You're muted, Farooq.
We should say thank you to Amelia and UNCTAD and James for bringing this flow of ideas together. I mean, I've learned so much from this, and I'm sure that's true for everybody. And I hope that we can do this more often than once a year. And I hope that we can do it in person, because there is really no substitute for face-to-face interactions. There's so many wonderful research projects that can be done. And I mean, I went through a list that came to the top of my mind, but among the more neglected areas is a return to research using, as Peter said, the manager as the focus of investigation, because a lot of the trade, FDI, et cetera, flows from companies, and that's based on managerial decisions on things like the substitution between automation and offshoring, Or even when we talk about automation, one of the speakers said that the kind of investment going to developing countries may be too automated, given the millions of people who are underemployed in some countries. Or another absolutely neglected area is the transfer of technology or intellectual property under alliances across national borders as a substitute for FDI and trade. So I hope that many of these wonderful ideas that have been voiced this afternoon or morning can be implemented in impactful policy resulting research. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our technical team for allowing us to expand 10 minutes. And thank you to our outstanding panel and distinguished speakers today. Thank you very much, and hope you join the RICH program that we have at the WIF this week. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.